The dog found her on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that stuck with Marcus Webb, because Tuesdays were supposed to be unremarkable. He'd let Biscuit off the leash at the tree line the way he always did, the same quarter-mile loop through the Oregon pines behind his property, the same routine they'd kept since Marcus had pulled the 14-pound beagle out of the county shelter 3 years ago, half-starved and trembling. Biscuit ran the loop in 8 minutes flat on good days. Today the dog had been gone for 40 and hadn't answered a single call. Marcus moved through the trees with a flashlight in one hand and a rising irritation that hadn't quite become worry yet. The beam caught pine bark, root systems, a scatter of dead needles on wet ground. September in Tillamook County meant perpetual damp. It seeped into your boots, your collar, the back of your neck. Marcus had lived here long enough to stop noticing, but tonight the cold felt different, pressurized somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm, except the sky through the canopy gaps was clear and full of stars. He heard Biscuit before he saw him, not barking, not his regular bark anyway, something lower, more deliberate. The sound a dog makes when it has decided a situation is serious and wants you to understand that. Marcus pushed through a stand of young firs and stopped. Biscuit sat at the edge of a shallow ravine, perfectly still, his short tail doing a single slow sweep every few seconds. In 4 years Marcus had never seen the dog sit that still for anything. Not for a squirrel, not for a stranger at the gate, not for the bear they'd startled on the ridge 2 summers back. At the bottom of the ravine, about 8 feet down a bank of loose earth and exposed roots, something was lying against a fallen cedar. His first thought, the rational one, the one shaped by 41 years of ordinary life, was that it was a deer. Injured maybe, hit by a car and wandered in to die. He'd seen it before. Then he angled the flashlight down, and the beam caught the shape wrong. Too tall, too arranged. The limbs at angles that suggested bilateral symmetry but not the bilateral symmetry he knew, and the color was wrong. In the flashlight's wash he could see it was a deep gray-green mottled like stone, like the underside of a leaf. Not fur, not skin. Not anything he had words for. He stayed at the top of the bank for 11 seconds. He counted later, going over it. 11 seconds of standing there with the flashlight and the silence and Biscuit making that low, deliberate sound beside him. And then something shifted down in the ravine, and Marcus Webb heard what he was almost certain was a breath. He went down. The bank crumbled under his boots and he half slid, half scrambled, catching himself on a root with one hand while keeping the flashlight pointed at the figure below. Up close it was worse and better simultaneously. Worse because he could see it clearly now. Better because clarity, even terrifying clarity, was something his mind could work with. She was roughly humanoid. That was the word that surfaced, humanoid, some science fiction word from 100 movies he'd watched in his youth, and the absurdity of it, the collision of this pine-smelling ravine and that borrowed word, almost made him laugh. Almost. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, a head that sat on a neck in the right general arrangement. But the proportions were elongated, the fingers of one visible hand too long, too many joints. Her face, and it was a face, with features his brain assembled into something like expression, was partially turned toward him, and the eye that was visible was very large, lidded sideways rather than up and down, and it was open. She was watching him. Around her the ground was wrong. Scorched in a rough ellipse, pine needles fused to the soil. The fallen cedar split and blackened along one edge as if something had impacted it from above at tremendous speed. No crater, though. Whatever she'd fallen from, the forest had absorbed most of it. "Hey," Marcus said, "because what else do you say?" Biscuit had followed him down the bank and now pressed against his calf, not frightened, just present. Solid. The dog's warmth was more grounding than Marcus would have expected. The alien, the word came now and sat in his chest like a stone, made a sound. Low and modulated, 3 distinct tones in rapid sequence. Her visible hand moved just slightly, and Marcus saw the injury then, a section of her torso left side where the surface had been ruptured. Dark fluid had dried around it, the color of oxidized copper. More of it still moved slowly, catching the flashlight. Whatever internal architecture she had, it was not doing well. "Okay," Marcus said. "Okay." He crouched, getting down to her level, and tried to make his face as readable as possible. He didn't know why, he just felt that was the right move. "I'm not going to hurt you. I don't know if you can understand that, but I'm not." The sideways eye tracked him. Biscuit walked forward 3 careful steps and sat down 18 inches from her head. The alien's eye moved to the dog, stayed there. Something in her body language, in the tension he could read in those 2 long fingers, eased very slightly. Marcus took that as something, he wasn't sure what. He pulled his phone from his jacket and looked at it for a long time. 4 bars. He could call 911 in under 30 seconds. He thought about what would happen next if he did that, the dispatch, the deputies, then the state police, then the call up whatever chain of command dealt with things like this. And somewhere in that chain, the decision-making would leave his hands entirely, and he wasn't sure what came after that for her. Whether it was good, or whether it was the kind of thing that left no record. He put the phone back in his pocket. "All right," he said, "let's see what we can do." Marcus Webb was not, by any measure that would have impressed anyone, a remarkable man. He was 41, divorced, worked remote IT support for a mid-size insurance company in Portland, and had moved to the Tillamook property after the divorce to be somewhere his ex-wife was not. He had no military background, no medical training, no particular expertise in crisis management. He had, however, spent 15 years as the kind of person who fixed problems quietly, because no one else was available to fix them. And that disposition, unremarkable as it was, turned out to matter quite a lot in the next 6 hours. He couldn't move her, not safely. She was too large and too damaged, and he didn't know enough about her physiology to risk it. What he could do was bring things to her. He made 3 trips back to the house. First for blankets and a tarp to rig a shelter against the coming rain. Second for his full first aid kit and the flashlight charger, and a thermos of water he didn't know whether she could drink. Third for the camping lantern and his sleeping bag, and the folding camp chair he hadn't used since the year before. He didn't tell himself any stories about why he was doing this. He didn't frame it as heroism or destiny or any of the things a person might reach for to give shape to an impossible situation. He just did each step in sequence, the same way he did every problem at work, and he let the next step reveal itself from the one before it. By the time he had the lantern going in the ravine, the rain had started, a light coastal drizzle, the kind that soaks you so gradually you don't notice until you're through. The tarp held. He draped one of the blankets over her lower body, not touching her directly, just laying it close so the heat would reach her if heat was what she needed. She watched everything he did. The wound in her side concerned him. The dark copper fluid had largely stopped moving, which might have been good or might have been the opposite. He had no way to know. He sat 3 feet away and watched it and felt profoundly useless in a way that had nothing to do with incompetence. Some problems were just beyond the tools you had. Biscuit lay down between them, equidistant, and went to sleep. Marcus looked at the dog and almost laughed again. "You're not worried," he said. The dog's ear twitched. He looked back at her. In the lantern light her coloring was less alarming. The gray-green had depths to it, something almost iridescent in the modeling, like wet slate. Her features, the more he sat with them, resolved into something he could read in the rough sense, not human expression, but expression nonetheless. Whatever she was feeling was not rage and it was not terror. It was something quieter, the focused, internal quality of a person in pain who has decided to endure it. He recognized it. He'd felt it in himself more than once. "I'm Marcus," he said, not for any practical reason. Just because sitting in silence with something felt wrong, and talking felt like the smallest possible gesture toward connection. The three-tone sound again, then a pause, then a single tone lower held. He had no idea what it meant, but she'd responded, and that was something. She lost consciousness around 2 in the morning. He knew because her eye closed, the sideways lid drawing shut from the outer corner inward, and the quality of her breathing changed. Slower, more labored. He spent 20 minutes telling himself this was probably fine, the way any injured creature needs to sleep, and then spent another 20 minutes knowing it wasn't fine and trying to figure out what he could possibly do about it. What he came back to was the wound. He'd seen enough first aid to know that a wound that had stopped bleeding visibly could still be dangerous, internal damage, pressure building in the wrong place. He didn't know her anatomy. He didn't know if pressure or cold or heat was correct. He knew that doing nothing while she slipped away felt like a specific kind of failure he wouldn't be able to live with. He moved close, closer than he'd allowed himself before. Up close, the quality of her skin, surface, whatever it was remarkable in the way natural things sometimes were. Textured at a microscopic level, the modeling not random but structured, like the scales of a pine cone seen from a distance. He held the flashlight near the wound and looked at it carefully. The ruptured section had edges that were trying to close. Slowly, imperfectly, the material at the margins was contracting toward the center. The body was trying to seal itself. It just wasn't doing it fast enough. He had butterfly bandages in the first aid kit. He also had the particular calm of a person who has run out of better options. He got as close as he was willing to get and worked carefully, using the bandages not on the wound directly. He didn't trust himself to understand enough, but around it, reinforcing the edges the way he'd once reinforced a cracked pipe with epoxy tape while waiting for the plumber. Supporting what was already trying to happen rather than substituting his own judgment for hers. Biscuit woke up and watched this with what seemed like approval. It took him 40 minutes. When he was done, he sat back against the cedar and let his hands stop shaking. Around 4, she spoke to him. Not in tones this time. Something else, a sound that moved through registers his ears weren't built to fully process, some of it in frequencies he felt in his chest rather than heard. He didn't understand it, but she was looking at him when she made it, and the looking had intention, and the intention was not hostile. "You're welcome," he said, "I think." The sideways eye half closed, opened, half closed again. He watched this and then understood, with the slow certainty of a man who had spent many years watching creatures communicate, that she was doing what Biscuit did when Marcus scratched him behind the ear. He almost wept then, he was not certain why. Something about the distance that had just gotten smaller, even for a moment. She was still alive at dawn. The rain had stopped. Light came into the ravine, gray and gradual, and in it Marcus could see her more clearly than the lantern had allowed. The wound looked different in daylight. The copper-dark fluid had dried completely, and what he could see at the margins of the bandage work was something that might have been closure. New tissue, or whatever the equivalent was. The process he'd been reinforcing had continued. She was awake again. The eye followed him as he stood and stretched and felt every joint in his body register 41 years. He went back to the house, made coffee, drank half of it standing at the kitchen window looking at the tree line. Then poured the rest into the thermos, added a second thermos of water, took them both and went back. She watched him come down the bank. When he sat and opened the water thermos, she reached for it, slowly, the 2 long fingers curling at a speed that telegraphed her exhaustion, and he let her take it. Watched her figure out the mechanism and drink. Watched her expression and could not read it precisely, but felt the quality of it as a kind of private relief. "Good," he said, and meant it more than the word usually carried. The morning passed in something that wasn't quite peace but occupied the same general territory. He sat with her. Biscuit moved between them, occasionally putting his nose against her arm, occasionally pressing his weight against Marcus's side. The forest woke up around them, birds, wind, the slow drip of rain still falling from the canopy. He thought about the wound that had made her fall. Not an accident. The edges of the burned section she'd landed in had a direction to them, a vector. Something had hit her. Something had sent her down through whatever distance separated where she'd been from this ravine. She'd been shot down. He thought about that for a while without saying it aloud. Then thought about what that meant for what came next, that whoever had shot her had presumably watched her fall, had presumably tracked the trajectory, was presumably either indifferent to whether she'd survived or actively interested in confirming that she hadn't. He looked up through the canopy at the clear morning sky. "We should probably move you," he said. It took the better part of the day. She could support some of her own weight less than he'd hoped, more than he'd feared. She had, against all probability, understood something of what he was trying to do before he'd finished gesturing at the bank and the sky and the trees beyond. He would learn later that understanding was perhaps not the right word. She had not understood his language. She had understood his intent, in the way that Biscuit understood his intent, through tone, posture, the pointed shape of attention. And she had trusted it, for reasons he could only guess at. They made it to the house. He'd gotten her up the bank on the second attempt, with a rope from the garage looped under her arms and himself at the top pulling while she used her legs. The effort cost her and cost him. They stopped 3 times between the ravine and the back door, once for 5 minutes while she breathed through what he took to be pain, and he stood beside her with one hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching it. The second bedroom was where he put her. The bed was too small, but the floor beside it was not. He folded every blanket in the house and put them in a nest the way you would for a large dog, and she lowered herself into it with the laborious care of a person who has learned not to trust their own body, and Biscuit immediately inserted himself into the space beside her hip and did not move. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at his guest, and felt the particular mix of terror and responsibility that he imagined was not unlike becoming a parent, which he had not done. "I don't know what you eat," he said. "I don't know what you need. I'm going to figure it out." The sideways eye blinked its slow, deliberate blink. He took that as okay. The next 3 days were the closest thing to an education Marcus had ever received outside of a classroom, except the subject was one no classroom had ever offered. She healed faster than he would have believed possible. The wound closed fully, not just at the margins by the end of the second day, the copper-dark stain fading to something lighter, the surface reconstituting itself in a way that reminded him of how water heals after you put your hand through it. The biological architecture under her surface was clearly extraordinary, which answered his question about why he'd found her alive at all given what the impact zone in the ravine had looked like. She ate. Not anything he offered at first. She regarded each thing he brought with a scrutiny that felt clinical, some sense he didn't have giving her information he couldn't access. But on the second morning he found her in the kitchen standing at the window with Biscuit at her feet, and she pointed at the backyard where a deer was moving through the grass, and then pointed at herself, and Marcus put together that she was telling him something about photosynthesis, or the equivalent. Light and nutrition in some arrangement he didn't fully grasp. He moved a chair into the sunniest corner of the living room and let her have it. She spent the mornings there, and he worked at his laptop nearby and didn't make a thing of it, and somewhere in the rhythm of that shared space, a kind of communication began to develop, not language, not quite, but something built from gesture and repeated reference and Biscuit's ongoing mediation between them. The dog had, from the first night, treated her with the same matter-of-fact attachment he gave Marcus, no hierarchy implied, just this person also lives here and is safe. Marcus didn't know whether she had something like a family, something like a home, people who worried about her. He found he was afraid to ask, not because asking would be wrong, but because the answer might be one that moved the timeline of her leaving toward now rather than later. The fourth day, she showed him the scar. Not the new wound that was almost invisible now, the surface hardly distinguishable from the surrounding area. A different one, older. On the inside of her right forearm, a pattern of deliberate marks that were clearly not injury. He looked at it for a long time and then looked at her. She touched it with one long finger, then touched the side of her head, then looked at him with the kind of expression he'd come to understand as an attempt to convey something she knew the words weren't right for. "It's a suppressor," he said. He didn't know where the word came from, it just arrived. She held very still for a moment, then that slow blink. Yes, he understood. Something she'd been given or made to contain what she was. To keep her signals quiet, her presence undetectable. Something that had broken in the fall or been broken by whatever had hit her, and now was the reason that what had hit her might be looking. She wasn't just injured. She was broadcasting. Marcus went through the house that night after she'd slept, standing at each window and looking out at the dark. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew the knowing had changed things, that there was a difference between sheltering something that had fallen and sheltering something that was being hunted. He was not a fighter. He did not have weapons beyond a hunting rifle in the back of the closet that had belonged to his father and had not been fired in 11 years. He did not have allies he could call without an explanation he wasn't ready to give. He had a house, a dog, a woman from somewhere he couldn't name who was healing in his spare bedroom. He sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning and made a list of what he actually had. It was the kind of thing he did with network problems at work, not what he wished were true, not what the documentation said should be true, what was actually true. You fixed from what you had. He had a property well off the main road, well off any regular patrol. He had, as of the last 4 days, a slowly improving ability to communicate with someone who had extraordinary senses and was, despite her damage, clearly intelligent. He had a dog who had, for reasons Marcus had stopped trying to explain, become the primary bridge between them. He had himself, unremarkable, unheroic, but present. He thought about the Scanner cop movie he'd watched as a kid, late on a Saturday night on a channel that played low-budget sci-fi after midnight. The cop who kept his abilities suppressed with medication, who didn't want to be what he was, who had to choose in the end between staying hidden and being what the situation required. The message of it had been clunky and obvious, and he had loved it unreservedly because he'd been 12, and the head explosion scene was amazing. But the thing underneath it, the thing about how you couldn't indefinitely suppress what you were when someone needed you to be it, that thing had gone in somewhere. He thought about how the villain had worked through ordinary people, turned them against their own, used the network of the trusted against the things the trusted were supposed to protect. He thought about how the only way to fight that was from inside it. She woke him at 3 with a hand on his shoulder, light as anything, and he was on his feet before he was fully conscious, some animal part of him already ahead of the thinking. She was at the window, not looking out, facing away from it, deliberately, the way you'd avoid looking at something that might see you look. 3 fingers raised, her right hand 3. He understood, 3 of whatever she was tracking, outside, somewhere close enough that she could feel them despite the broken suppressor, or perhaps because of it, she could feel them and they could feel her, and the equilibrium was currently in the not-quite-contact stage that he somehow knew wouldn't last. He dressed in the dark without turning on a light, went to the closet and took out his father's rifle and checked it the way he'd been taught, methodically, without drama, then stood in the hallway and thought. She was behind him. He turned, and in the faint ambient light of a nearly full moon through the bedroom window, he could see her more clearly than he usually did. The mottled surface shifted in certain lights to something almost luminous, faint and controlled, like the way foxfire works in old wood. In this moment it wasn't controlled. It moved at the edges of her, irregular and agitated, and he understood in the wordless way he'd come to understand many things in 4 days that she was afraid. Not for herself. He held up one finger. Wait. She went still. He went out the back. The Oregon night was cold and completely clear. The moon had risen enough to light the field behind the house in long silver-gray tones, and in it Marcus could see nothing for the first 30 seconds. Then he let his eyes relax, let go of the hunting look, the focused look, the looking for something look, and started seeing what was there instead. The shape at the far tree line was motionless in the way that only something trying to be motionless could be motionless, too still, like a held breath. He watched it and let 20 seconds pass and watched it again and thought, no, not there. The one there is the distraction. He moved along the side of the house, back against the siding, and came around the corner of the woodpile and saw the second one. Or saw its absence, a patch of the moonlit grass where the shadow fell wrong, geometry that didn't match the tree and fence angles around it. Something displacement dark in a way natural dark wasn't. The third he felt before he saw, and he attributed this to adrenaline until later when he could afford to think about it more carefully. A pull in his inner ear, a pressure behind his eyes. Not painful, not incapacitating, just present in a way that wasn't usually present. He turned slowly and it was in the barn doorway, 10 meters off, close enough that the moonlight caught the outline. Tall, two-jointed, familiar in its wrongness from the ravine 5 days ago. Armed or the equivalent. Marcus Webb stood in his backyard in the middle of the night with a hunting rifle and no plan and thought, all right. Then he thought about what he actually had. He went inside. She looked at him when he came back in with an expression that was, by now, fully readable. She'd expected him to come back scared or dead, and he'd done neither. He set the rifle down and got the lantern. Got, from the back of the utility drawer, the small emergency strobe, the one he kept for power outages, the one with the multi-frequency setting, the one that could hit frequencies well outside normal human visual range. He held it up to her. She looked at it. He pointed at the mark on her forearm, the broken suppressor, then at the strobe, then at her. The long, slow blink that meant yes, but. He understood the but. What she was broadcasting right now was distress damage. What he was asking was whether they could turn that into something else. Whether there was a way to use what was broken as the mechanism, to push the signal from bleed into broadcast. Not her location, but something encoded in her location. Something like a call. She took the strobe from him, held it for a long time, her fingers moving over the surface with a delicacy that reminded him of a musician reading something in the grain of an instrument. Then she handed it back and touched his wrist, 2 quick taps, like a code. He understood when I tell you. He went to the window and watched. Beside him, Biscuit sat alert, ears tracking. The 3 shapes were moving now. The distraction at the tree line was making its way toward the house slowly, and the displacement shadow in the grass was parallel, and the one from the barn had moved and he couldn't find it for a moment and then did close now. Coming up the back approach, 10 meters, 8. He looked at her. She held up a hand, not yet. 6 meters, 5. Her hand dropped. He hit the strobe on multi-frequency, and she did something he couldn't see and didn't need to see. Her body throwing back what it had been leaking for 4 days, but shaped now, structured, aimed the way you'd aim a speaker if your speaker was your entire self. And the barn door beside which the closest one stood burst outward from the inside as whatever had been waiting in the threshold staggered back, and the shape in the field stopped moving, and the one at the tree line went very still. Marcus stood at the window with the strobe and watched. The 3 shapes did not advance. He understood, in the trembling, intelligent clarity that follows sustained terror, that the signal had changed. That what they'd been tracking was damage, and now they were receiving something else entirely. Something that said what this is no longer what you tracked here to finish. Something that made the calculation on their side shift. They were still for 4 minutes by his watch. Then the one in the field moved, and the one at the tree line moved, and the direction was back the way they'd come. He stood at the window until they were gone, and then stood there a while longer just to be sure. She left 3 days after that. Not immediately. There was a period of sleep and recovery, and he thought transmission, though he could no longer be certain what she was doing or who she was doing it with. He gave her the space for it. He kept Biscuit fed and walked the long way around the property each morning, and didn't ask questions he had no right to. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was standing in the kitchen when he came downstairs, dressed in what she'd been wearing when he found her, the fabric apparently self-repairing in whatever way her skin had repaired, and the quality of the morning was different in the way that mornings are different when they are the last of something. He made coffee. She stood by the window and the light. Biscuit moved between them. He didn't say he wished she'd stay. He didn't say be safe. He didn't say any of the things you say because you can't find the right thing and the closest approximations will have to do. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she raised one hand and made the 2-tap gesture on her own forearm, the code, the signal for when. He understood this too. He understood it as, you knew when. You acted when it mattered. Not a thank you in the way the word worked for him, but something more specific than that. A recognition of the particular thing that had been done correctly. He nodded. She was gone by noon, not through the door. Just gone in the way things go when the mechanisms involved are beyond the framework you have for such things. The mark was on his wrist afterward, faint, gray-green like mottled slate. Not the suppressor mark, something different. He ran a thumb over it and felt nothing unusual, just skin, just a mark. Biscuit nosed at his hand. Yeah, Marcus said, I know. He thought about calling someone for a week and a half, and then stopped thinking about it. There was no one to call that wouldn't set off a sequence of events he couldn't predict the end of, and he had a strong instinct for the difference between problems that needed outside resolution and problems that were already resolved. The mark faded by October, except in certain lights. Direct sun, usually. He would be at his laptop working a ticket on a network issue in Portland, and the autumn light would come through the window and catch his wrist at a particular angle, and there it would be, gray-green and specific, like the underside of a leaf. He never went looking. Never set up cameras in the woods or filed any reports, or told anyone the thing that Tuesday had turned out to contain. He lived on the property and worked his remote job and walked Biscuit on the quarter-mile loop every evening, and the loop took longer now, because he always stopped at the tree line for a few minutes before turning back. Listening more than looking. In November, a storm came through and dropped a fir across the back fence, and Marcus spent a Saturday afternoon with a chainsaw clearing it, Biscuit supervising from a safe distance. And when he was done, he stood in the gap the tree had left and looked up at the sky through the opened canopy, blue, enormous, dimensionless in the way skies are when you let yourself stop measuring them. He thought about what was up there. Not in the abstract way he'd thought about it before, in the pleasant theoretical way you think about things that have nothing to do with you. In the specific way, the way you think about a place when you know someone who lives there. He thought about what it cost to fall that far and survive it. He thought about a dog who had known, before he had, that the thing at the bottom of the ravine was worth going down to. He went inside and fed Biscuit and made dinner and turned on the television and watched something he wouldn't remember later. And when the Oregon night came full and cold against the windows, he didn't feel, as he had sometimes felt in the years of the divorce and the retreat and the general quiet failure of becoming someone he hadn't planned to be, alone. The mark caught the lamplight when he reached for the remote, gray-green, specific. He held his wrist up and looked at it for a moment, and then went back to watching whatever was on. Outside, the sky was clear and full of stars, and had always been full of things moving through it, and would continue to be. He had been paying attention. That was all it had taken.